Hi everyone. Welcome back to my story. No voiceovers, no dialogues, just moments and what they make you feel. This is the turning point, when the truth breaks the silence and every lie has a price. Follow Tu Tieu as she steps through betrayal and walks alone toward what's real. After a night of endless rain, the ground was soaked, and water rose like a silent tide across the field. The damp air clung tightly to every breath. Tu Tieu stood at the edge of the pond, unmoving, her gaze fixed on the dark, swelling surface. No complaints, no hesitation. In the chaos of nature, she saw something else, a chance to plant water spinach on floating soil. The idea didn't come from inspiration, but from pressure. She knew time was short, and her options fewer. Recent failed harvests had left scars, emotional and financial. The little savings she had were nearly gone. If this attempt failed, this land would no longer be able to sustain her. She walked to the back of the house, pulling out bamboo stalks caked in mud. Her eyes scanned each node like she was choosing allies for an unfair battle. The mud squelched beneath her feet. The bamboo cracked in protest. But Tu Tieu didn't stop. She wasn't just building a raft, she was resisting collapse. Every step forward was a decision. Every cut piece of bamboo wasn't just material. It was a line drawn between hope and despair. And in the stillness of the cold morning, something inside her caught fire. Small, quiet, but unwilling to die. She wasn't fighting the rain, or the flood, or even failure. She was fighting the quiet whisper inside that told her to give up. And as she carried the bamboo forward, each breath was both a burden and a promise that she wasn't done yet. The air in the room was cold and still, like glass. But inside Yuri, everything was breaking. He sat there, trying to keep his voice steady as he shared the bitter truth. The large sum his company had transferred was nowhere to be found in the partners' records. No trace, no confirmation, only a terrifying silence. His eyes fell on the contract lying flat on the table. So many signatures, so many stamps, and yet now it all felt brutally meaningless. He had trusted the partnership, believed in a path forward. But now it seemed more like a trap than a transaction. The deeper he went, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a mistake. It could have been planned, carefully, coldly. The accountant on the other side had vanished, and the paperwork didn't match. And time was slipping away, fast and merciless. Still, somewhere beneath the weight of failure, there was resolve. Yuri refused to collapse. He would find that accountant's address, even if it was the thinnest thread. Because if he gave up now, it wouldn't just be the money that was lost. It would be the trust of those who believed in him, the name he carried, the promise he once made. As the room closed in around him, Yuri knew this wasn't about business anymore. It was about who he chose to be when everything turned against him. And this time, he wouldn't let the darkness win. The morning passed quietly, broken only by the sound of the saw grinding through aged bamboo. Every cut Tu Tieu made didn't just divide the stalks. It sliced through layers of worry buried deep inside her. She worked alone, her hands steady and strong, but her eyes carried the weight of doubt. Each segment of bamboo was a silent vow. This plan must work. Once the stalks were trimmed and tied tightly with wire, she began hauling them toward the pond. It took every ounce of strength. The ground was wet, and mud splattered across her clothes. At times, the stubborn bamboo snapped back and struck her shins, sharp and sudden. But she kept moving. This was no longer farm work. It had become a test of endurance, of faith. Finally, the raft took shape. Simple, rough, but solid. She lined the base with plastic sacks, then began shoveling in soil. Every scoop was a quiet defiance, each handful packed with silent hope. Her body ached, her breath shallow, but her eyes held firm. She looked down at the rippling water below. It could nourish new life, or swallow everything whole. No one could know. But in that moment, Tu Tieu made her wager. Not with money, but with the last pieces of belief she had left. And in the quiet tension between survival and surrender, she chose to believe. Down the hospital corridor, Trang walked with unwavering eyes. The dim yellow lights cast soft shadows across her face, reflecting a quiet suspicion rising beneath her calm. She wasn't rushing, but each step was deliberate. In her hand, her phone glowed. Alan's medical records flickered across the screen, blurred, but revealing just enough to disturb her. She slipped quietly into the records room. The light was weak. The air smelled of old paper and antiseptic. Rows of files towered before her, dense with names, diagnoses, and dates. She moved slowly, turning each page with care. She wasn't just looking. She was bracing for what she might find. A name surfaced. She froze. The file showed a man with severe injuries, the attached report noting, "No known relatives, temporary amnesia, previously treated under a different identity." Her chest tightened. Alan. She left the room, leaning against the cold wall, her vision blurring. Her instincts, once vague, were now forming something undeniable. Alan wasn't just someone who happened to appear. He had a past, one carefully hidden. With trembling fingers, she unlocked her phone and typed a message to Tu Tieu. Her thumb hovered before she pressed send. The wind pushed through the window, carrying the sterile scent of medicine. Something was shifting, about to break. And in that fragile silence, Trang lit the first spark of truth. In the quiet of a small room, Tu Tieu sat still beneath the flickering glow of an old yellow bulb. Outside, rain had begun to fall, each drop heavy, bursting against the tin roof like echoes of unrest. On the table, her phone buzzed. A message from Trang. She opened it. The screen revealed a short sentence, sharp as a blade. Alan had amnesia. An old file exists under a different name. Tu Tieu froze. In an instant, her breath caught. She stared into the distance, lips pressed, eyes dimmed. A chill spread through her chest. Her fingers trembled. Images of Alan rushed back, his steady hand pulling her from chaos, his comforting embrace. Those eyes she thought held nothing but truth. Now, every memory felt like shattered glass turning inward. She sank to the floor, back against the wall, eyes searching the ceiling like it might offer answers. The rain outside grew louder, blending with the chaos in her heartbeat. Tu Tieu didn't cry, but her eyes reflected the storm. She knew there was no going back. The trust she held on to so tightly was dissolving, not with drama, but with quiet devastation. A flash of lightning streaked past the window. Truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a wound, and she had just been cut. The door burst open without warning. Alan stood there, soaked in rain, eyes hollow like he had run through 1,000 storms. Tu Tieu turned. Their eyes met. Silence hung in the air, stretched taut like a string ready to snap. No words were spoken, but everything was already known. Alan stepped inside, each footfall heavy with unspoken guilt. He didn't smile, didn't offer excuses. He simply stood there, in front of the woman who once trusted him as her only light. Tu Tieu remained seated, back against the wall, her gaze icy and unmoved. No nod, no reaction. The air turned solid, thick with everything unsaid. The rain outside poured relentlessly, its rhythm foreign and mournful, like a requiem for something just lost. Trust. Or maybe something deeper. Alan sat down but kept his distance. He placed something on the table, an old water-damaged folder. Tu Tieu's eyes didn't blink. That was the truth, straight from him, no more lies, nothing left to hide. They sat there in a small room, two people, one seeking forgiveness, the other unsure if her heart still had the strength to give it. There were no screams, no accusations, just silence so dense it fractured the air. And within that silence, the past, like a wounded beast, began to stir once more. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through dusty glass. Tu Tieu sat quietly and opened the folder Alan had left. The worn, stained pages told a story no one could have imagined. Not just Alan's secret, but a web of deception woven by those she once trusted. Her hands trembled. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes. Her world, once fragile, had collapsed completely. The room was silent. Only the rustle of paper and the cold tick of the clock echoed around her. Alan stood outside the door, not entering. The door was slightly ajar, like a line drawn between two worlds. On one side, the past, heavy with wrongs. On the other, a present with no way back. Tu Tieu rose. Her eyes no longer held anger nor hope, only the calm resolve of someone who had touched rock bottom and returned. She walked to the doorway. The wind blew gently, lifting her hair behind her. They stood face to face. Alan opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand, silencing him. In that moment, she forgave, but did not forget. Not for him, for herself. Then she turned and walked away, steady, unwavering. The door closed behind her with a soft click, like the final page of a painful chapter turning, making way for something new. No more illusions, only truth remained.